Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: "It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." From the British author J.K. Rowling. In the last part, we went through games number 3, 4, 5, and 6 of the illustrative game section of the book. Moving further, we will go through game number 7 of the illustrative game section of the book. This game was played between ILYA RABINOVICH versus Aron Nimzowitsch in the Baden-Baden tournament at Baden-Baden, Germany in 1925. Ilya Leontievich Rabinovich was a Russian and later Soviet chess player and writer who played in the first half of the 20th century. He was among the best chess players in his country for 3 decades, from 1910 to 1940. Rabinovich with the white pieces and Nimzowitsch with the black. Notes by Aron Nimzowitsch. b4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, b6, knight c3, bishop b7, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, bishop e7, e3, d6, bishop d3, and knight d7. Black has a solid but cramped game. As a rule, such a game can only be slowly opened up. Castles, castles, queen e2 and e5. Slower, therefore more true to type, would be knight h5. So e5, d takes on e5, and bishop takes on f3. Not knight takes on e5. Knight takes on e5, d takes on e5, and rook d1 with pressure in the d file. As such, bishop takes on f3, g takes on f3, knight takes on e5, bishop takes on f6, bishop takes on f6, bishop e4, and rook d8. White with his d file and a knight outpost at d5 will be able to force c6. That is already clear. True, the black d-pawn will not be difficult to defend, for it stands on a square of the same color as their bishop. But what is going to happen in the g file? This we shall soon see. Rook d1, knight d7, knight d5, knight c5, bishop b1, and a5. No outpost, yet strong. The student should learn by careful practice how to establish knights so that they cannot be driven away. King h1 and g6. This would in any event be forced by queen c2. Rook g1, bishop g7, rook g3, c6, knight f4, and rook b7. The situation in the g file may now be regarded as so far cleared up that it is evident that the threat consists in a sacrifice at g6, that is, the revolutionary attack. The slow undermining operations by h4, h5 would be, on the other hand, difficult to carry through. queen c2, queen f6 and b3. He might have gone in for the combination knight h5, queen takes on b2, rook takes on g6, f takes on g6 and queen takes on g6, but the attack would hardly have succeeded. So b3, rook e8 and knight e2. In order to bring the knight to d4, White's dilemma consists in having two files, the d and g. He cannot quite make up his mind which to use, and on this indecision his game goes to pieces. Rook d7, rook d2, rook d8, knight f4, king f8, queen d1 and h5. Double exclamation mark. Not merely to make bishop h6 possible, but also because the h-pawn has a great role to play. Queen g1, bishop h6, knight e2 and d5. Gets rid of the weakness at d6 and soon commands the d file. C takes on d5, rook takes on d5, rook takes on d5, rook takes on d5 and f4. If knight d4, then bishop f4. For instance, knight d4, bishop f4, e takes on f4, queen takes on d4, f4. Apologies, f5, h4, rook g4, queen c3, and the pawn at f3 is hard to defend. So f4 and bishop g7. The decision to abandon the diagonal h6 to f4, a difficult one to have to make, becomes comparatively easy to one who knows that there will be impediments. Here, likely a knight at d4 to be bombarded. I did not like rook d2 at once instead of bishop g7 because of the reply knight d4, bishop takes on f4 and rook f3. So bishop g7 and queen c1. I had expected here at last the sacrifice at g6 and had in anticipation prepared a real problem in reply. Namely, bishop takes on g6, h4, rook g4, f takes on g6, rook takes on g6, queen f5, rook takes on g7, queen e4 check, queen g2 forced, rook d1 check, knight g1, and now the point h3. Queen takes on e4 and knight takes on e4, threatening mate at f2. So queen c1 and queen d6. The exploitation of the d file which now follows is all according to book. I mean my book, but is here embellished by a pretty feature. Bishop c2, knight e4, rook g2, h4, and knight g1. I was glad to be rid of the knight and played knight c3. This knight maneuver makes possible the invasion of the enemy's base. Here his first and second ranks. A4. If A3, then knight A2, winning the A pawn. So A4, knight A2, queen F1 and knight B4. Here I had the unpleasant feeling that I had let the bishop escape, had allowed him elbow room. Bishop E4 and rook D1. My first thought was, what a pity. Now the queen will also find her way into the open. But then I saw the mating spectre loom up, the same one which I had known well ever since the 33rd move. Queen C4, F5, Bishop F3, H3, Rook G3, Knight D3, Queen C2 and Rook C1. And here I rejoiced over the Queen's involuntary return home. Queen E2 and Rook B1, where White resigned the game. For the turning move, Rook B2 will be deadly in effect. The impression we get from this game is that the system supports combinative play most effectively. Next is game number 8, which was played between Friedrich Samisch versus Aron Nimzowitsch in the Copenhagen tournament of 1923 at Copenhagen, Denmark. Friedrich Samisch was a German chess player and theorist who played in the 20th century. He was among the inaugural recipients of the title International Grandmaster from FIDE in 1950. Nimzowitsch writes of the game as follows. And now a short game, which is especially interesting since the outpost appears only as a threat, as a mere ghost, and yet its effect is enormous. Samisch with the white pieces and Nimzowitsch with the black. Notes by Aron Nimzowitsch. D4, knight F6, C4, E6, knight F3, B6, G3, bishop B7, bishop G2, bishop E7, knight C3, castles, castles, D5, knight E5, and C6. Safeguards the position. C takes on D5, C takes on D5, bishop F4, and A6. Protects the outpost station C4, that is by A6 and B5. Rook C1, B5, Queen B3 and Knight C6. The ghost, with noiseless steps, they press on towards C4. Knight takes on C6. Samisch sacrifices 2 tempi, exchange of the tempo-eating knight at E5 for the knight which is already most undeveloped, merely to be rid of the ghost. Bishop takes on C6, H3, Queen D7, King H2 and Knight H5. I could have supplied him with yet a second ghost by Queen B7 and Knight to D7, to B6, to C4. But I wished to turn my attention to the king's side. So Knight H5, Bishop D2, F5, Queen D1, B4, Knight B1, Bishop B5, Rook G1. Bishop D6, e4 and f takes on e4. This sacrifice, which has a quite surprising effect, is based upon the following sober calculation: 2 pawns and the 7th rank, and an enemy queen's wing which cannot be disentangled. All this for only one piece. Queen takes on h5, rook takes on f2, queen g5, rook f8, king h1, rook f5, queen e3, bishop d3, rook e1 and h6, double exclamation mark. A brilliant move which announces zugzwang. White has not a move left. If, for example, king h2 or g4, then rook 5 to f3. Black can now make waiting moves with his king, and white must willy-nilly eventually throw himself upon the sword. So white resigned. Next is a game number 9, which was played between Aron Nimzowitsch versus AXEL Carl Martin Pritzel in the Copenhagen tournament of 1922 at Copenhagen, Denmark. AXEL Carl Martin Pritzel was a Danish chess player who played in the first half of the 20th century. Nimzowitsch with the white pieces and Pritzel with the black. Notes by Aron Nimzowitsch. d4, g6, e4, bishop g7, knight c3, d6, bishop e3, knight f6, bishop e2, castles, and queen d2 in order to exchange black's dark bishop by bishop h6. e5, d takes on e5, d takes on e5, and castles long. The plan chosen by white is seductive in the simplicity of means to be employed. He intends, after allowing the exchange of queens, to get some advantage in the d file. Queen takes on d2 check, rook takes on d2 and c6. Moves which weaken such important points as d6 should be avoided if in any way possible. And in fact, a piece soon settles itself on this square. The important point to be observed by the student is that before c6, the d file was only under pressure, whereas after this move it is clearly weakened. It would have been better to forego c6 and play instead knight c6. For instance, the continuation might be h3 in order to play knight f3 without the fear of the reply knight g4, knight d4, knight f3, but not bishop takes on d4, e takes on d4, rook takes on d4 and knight g4. So knight f3 and knight takes on e2 check or knight takes on f3. Rook takes on e2 or bishop takes on f3 and white stands better. Nevertheless, knight c6 was the correct move. Only after h3, black must continue with bishop e6. For example, h3, bishop e6, Knight f3, h6, rook d1 and a6. In the position here reached, white has unquestionably full possession of the d file. Since, however, neither an invasion of the 7th rank by rook d7 nor the establishment of an outpost by knight d5 lies within the realm of possibility, the value of the file would seem to be problematical. White's e-pawn is in fact in need of protection, and this circumstance has a considerable crippling effect. Black has two courses open for consideration. A. To play at once rook f to d8 with the idea rook takes rook check, rook takes rook, rook takes rook check, knight takes rook, knight takes on e5 and knight takes on e4. Though this variation must be prepared for by king h7 or g5 so as to safeguard the h-pawn, else after the double exchange of rooks and knight takes on e5, knight takes on e4, there would follow knight takes on e4, bishop takes on e5 and bishop takes on h6. B. The slow maneuver rook f to c8 followed by king to f8 to e8 and finally the challenge of the rooks by rook d8. The fact that this last line of play is possible is significant proof of the small activity of white in the d file. But c6 was played in the game by black and white responded with a4. Apparently compromising, in reality well thought out. For firstly, b5, which would be an indirect and therefore unwelcome attack on the pawn at e4, must be prevented. And secondly, black's queen's wing is to be besieged. We feel ourselves justified in pursuing this ambitious plan, since now that c6 has been played, our positional advantage in the center is unquestionable and should have a real effect even on the wings. A proposition which may be thus formulated: a superior position in the center justifies a thrust on an extreme flank. Knight g4, bishop takes on g4, bishop takes on g4, knight e2 and knight d7. In unusual situations, ordinary moves are, it would seem, seldom suitable. The proper system for development here was knight a6, rook f to e8 and bishop f8. The weakness at d6 would then have been covered and the position would have been perfectly tenable. So knight d7, rook d1, knight d6, knight b6, b3, bishop f6, f3, bishop e6, a5, knight c8 and knight a4. It is now clear that the suggested development, knight a6 on the 12th move and so on, would have wasted less time than that in the text, knight d7 to b6 to c8. White has now a strong position on the extreme left and threatens to get a grip on the enemy with knight c5. We now see that a4 on the 10th move was not so very valueless as an attacking move. b6, an excellent parry. If a takes on b6, a takes on b6, and bishop takes on b6, then naturally bishop g5. So b6 and rook d3. The restricted advance in a file, which here is revealed in a singularly plastic form, in that the rook is brought from the d to the c file and thence to the a file. B takes on a5, rook c3. Apologies. B takes on a5, barred. The right move was rook b8, and black's position still had life in it. So b takes on a5, rook c3, knight e7, rook c5, rook b8, and knight c3. The a pawn won't run away. a6, rook takes on a5, king g7, knight b6, rook a7, and knight a4. The one knight made room for the other. Rook b7, rook takes on a6, knight c8, knight takes on c8, rook takes on c8, knight c5, rook c7, and rook d6. Now at last is the point seized, which black weakened by his ninth move, but its occupation had always been in the air. Rook d8 and rook takes on e6, where black resigned the game. In the notes to this game, we have become acquainted with the resources at the disposal of the defender of a file. Since the knowledge of these is of the greatest practical value in the conduct of a game, we give another example in the next game, which will be found instructive in the same sense. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowicz's My System here, and we shall continue onwards from the next one. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. 6 new supporters: Novelty Clock, John Cardiff, J Theory, BootyMedic, Googie Shilling, and Crasser Millionaire. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.